Cheryl Boy came up my stairs on a Sunday evening holding a glass baking dish she had borrowed from me 2 years earlier. That is the part I keep going back to. Not what she said. The dish. She'd taken it home from a funeral lunch in 2022 with a half pan of scalloped potatoes in it, and neither of us had thought about it once since. And there she was on the second floor landing at 7:10 on the 2nd of November with it washed and dried and a folded paper towel laid in the bottom so it wouldn't rattle. I took it and said something useless that I'd been meaning to ask for that back, and she said, "Ruth Ann, can I sit down?" The first thing I thought about, after she told me, wasn't my life. It was my daily ATM limit, $300. I stood in my own kitchen while my oldest friend cried at my table, and I did arithmetic about a bank machine. And then I got annoyed, genuinely annoyed, because I was scheduled to work Monday through Friday, and I couldn't see how I was supposed to do any of what she was telling me to do around a 40-hour week. That's who I was that night. 59 years old, $940 to my name, and my main reaction to the end of the ordinary world was scheduling. I should explain what I did for a living, because it shapes everything about how I saw the next 2 weeks. I worked the counter at Pike Street Check and Loan, check cashing, payday advances, money orders, wire transfers, prepaid cards, bus passes. 16 years. Before that, I was on the phones at a collections agency, which is where I met Cheryl in 1994. Both of us 28 and both of us hating it. People make assumptions about a place like Pike Street. Some of them are fair. But what it gave me was a very specific education. I could tell you, on any given week, exactly how much money the 4 blocks around me had and how fast it was moving. I knew whose disability hit on the 3rd. I knew which men cashed a check and immediately bought a money order for child support and which ones didn't. I knew that when people get scared about money, they don't spend less. They spend differently. I could read the neighborhood off the drawer. And 2 days before Cheryl came up my stairs, I had read something in the drawer and not understood it. Dennis Fay came in that Friday afternoon. Dennis had carried a rolling advance with us since 2021. $200, renewed every second Friday. Fees paid, principal never touched. And I had long since stopped saying anything about it because it wasn't my business, and he wasn't going to change. He came in around 4 and paid the whole thing off in cash and asked me to cancel the automatic renewal. I asked him if he'd hit something. He said no. He said his sister was driving down from Duluth Sunday to take his dog for a while. I said something like, "Oh, are you going somewhere?" And he said no. He just felt like being square with somebody. He tapped the counter twice with 2 fingers, which he always did, and left. I put the receipt in the drawer and thought, well, that's nice. That's the whole detail. A man paid a debt he didn't have to pay and sent his dog away. If I had been the person I like to think I am, I'd have followed it. But nobody follows that. You'd never leave the house. Cheryl worked in staffing for Marchant Health. Not a nurse, not a doctor, not anything you'd put in a movie. She built shift rosters for 3 hospitals and a dozen clinics. 24 years of it. She knew which anesthesiologist wouldn't work with which surgeon, and she knew how many warm bodies a floor needed at 3 in the morning in a snowstorm. And none of that has ever gotten her 1 minute of anyone's respect, including mine, if I'm honest. On Friday, the 31st, she and 3 other coordinators got put in a room and handed a framework. That was the word she used. A surge staffing framework. She had to sign an acknowledgement with her badge number on it, which she said had never happened before in 24 years. Not once, not even for the layoffs. She didn't understand the medical part. She said that twice. She kept saying she didn't know anything. She was just the scheduler. But she understood the shape of it. The way I could understand a neighborhood off a cash drawer. They wanted rosters ramping from the coming Saturday. They wanted all elective procedures cleared off the board starting Thursday. There was a line item for 400 cots and another for 200 more, if authorized. Somebody had asked her, in an email, to pull the phone numbers of every employee who'd worked the isolation units in 2020 and note which ones still lived within 20 miles. And there was a section she couldn't stop thinking about called Family Separation Protocol, which had nothing to do with beds or staffing, and which she was not supposed to open, and which she opened. It's about who's allowed to be with somebody, she said. It's about not letting people be with each other. She had her hands flat on my table. Cheryl has always had beautiful hands. She said, nobody said a word about what it is. Not one word, the whole meeting. That's what's wrong with it. If it was flu, they'd say flu. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She said, buy food, not fancy, enough that you don't have to go out for 3 weeks. And don't tell anybody it came from me. Then she said the part that I have chewed on ever since, which was, there's 4 of us. Ruth Ann, there's 4 of us who got it. I want to be very clear about something because I've heard people talk about this since like getting a warning is a lottery ticket. 6 days is not a gift. 6 days is a job you don't know how to do, with a deadline you can't verify, funded by a checking account with $940 in it, in a 540-square-foot apartment by a woman who does not own a car. I lived at the Dell Court. 12 units, 3 floors, brick, built in 1927. The kind of building where the front door lock had been broken and fixed and broken again since I moved in, and the male alcove always smelled like wet cardboard. Radiators. 1 gas boiler in the basement that belonged to a property company 2 states away. A hallway you weren't allowed to store anything in, and a wire storage cage per unit down in the basement that everybody used for bicycles and Christmas decorations. My unit was 2B. 1 bedroom, a kitchen you could touch both walls of, a coat closet, a bedroom closet, and about 18 inches under the bed. That was my entire warehouse. When people talk about stocking up, they picture a garage. I had a coat closet with a vacuum in it. I sat up until almost 2 that Sunday night with a legal pad, and I'd like to say I wrote something wise. What I wrote was a shopping list, and it was a bad one. Frozen chicken, ice cream, God help me, I actually wrote ice cream. Bags of salad. I was writing a grocery list for a woman who was going to have a working refrigerator forever. Underneath it, I wrote the only 2 lines that turned out to matter, and I wrote them almost as an afterthought. Cash, water. Monday. I called in and said I'd be late and went to Bell Credit Union at 9 when it opened, because I wanted to look at a person and not a machine. I asked the teller, a young man named Cyril, who I'd known since he was hired, to give me $800 in cash. He had to get the manager. Not because $800 is a lot of money, but because $800 was most of what was in there, and because the branch kept its own float, and because it was a Monday morning. It took 11 minutes. The manager asked me, pleasantly, if everything was all right, and I heard myself say I was helping my brother with a car. And I don't have a brother. That was my first lie of the week, and it came out so smooth it scared me a little. I walked out with $800 in an envelope and $140 in the account, and I felt like a criminal. And I want to say plainly, that was the single best hour of work I did in 6 days. Not because cash saved me. Cash had a window, and the window was shorter than I expected. But for about 9 days, in a 4-block radius, cash was the difference between a store selling you something and a store shrugging at you. Then I went to work. Monday at Pike Street was normal. That's the thing nobody believes. I stood behind glass for 8 hours and cashed payroll checks and sold 3 money orders and listened to Ozella Brandt complain about her landlord. And the whole time I had $800 in my coat pocket and a bomb in my chest, and the world went on being exactly what it had been on Friday. I told my first neighbor that evening badly. Tova Brandt in 2A is a home health aide, mid-40s, 12-year-old daughter named Simone, and a 2009 Corolla with a rusted rocker panel that she keeps alive out of spite. I knocked and asked if she'd be willing to drive me to the warehouse store on Tuesday, and I'd buy her gas and dinner. She said sure. Then she said, why? And I said, there's something going around. Hospitals are getting ready for something. I want to have some food in the house. Tova is not a stupid woman. She works in 6 different people's houses a week. She looked at me for a second and said, going around like what? I don't know, I said. Respiratory, maybe. Respiratory. I made it up on the spot because it sounded plausible and manageable. And it was the worst thing I could have said, because everybody had a category for that already. And the category came with a shrug. She said okay. She said she should probably get some soup. She did not get any soup. That's the whole lesson of my first 2 days, and I paid full price for it. A warning you water down so it can't be traced back to anyone is a warning that doesn't work. It's not a smaller version of the truth. It's a different thing entirely. It's noise. Tuesday was the warehouse store, and it was a failure so complete I'm almost fond of it now. We went at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, which should have been dead. The lot was full. Not panic full, nobody was running, just full in a wrong way. On a Tuesday in November, with an unusual number of men my age standing at the back of pickup trucks, rearranging things. Inside, there was a hand-lettered sign at the entrance. Limit 2 per household on bottled water, paper products, canned protein, rice. I want to be fair to that store. Those limits were sensible. Those limits were, on balance, a decent thing to do. They were also, for me, a wall. I had come with a car, which I almost never had, and one shot at using it, and the store was politely informing me that having a car did not matter. Then the card readers went down. Not dramatically. A girl at the front said the system was slow, and everybody stood there for about 40 minutes. I heard 3 separate people say the word cyber attack, and I heard one man tell his wife it was the wind. There is nothing on earth like a checkout line to teach you how people handle information. I paid cash, $206, and I remember the amount because of what I got for it. 2 cases of water, 2 big bags of rice, 2 cans of chili because that was the limit, and then a lot of nonsense I grabbed out of pure animal urgency. Crackers, 4 jars of peanut butter, cereal, a family pack of tortillas that molded in 9 days. And then Tova's phone went off. Because her 11 o'clock client's daughter couldn't get anybody on the line at the pharmacy, and she had to go. We were in that store 55 minutes, and she apologized the entire ride home. I sat in that Corolla with my knees against a case of water and understood that I had just wasted my single best transportation opportunity of the week on the biggest, most crowded, most rule-bound store in the county, and that everything I actually needed was within 4 blocks of my front door in places nobody thinks about. Wednesday and Thursday, I did it the boring way, and the boring way worked. I bought a used folding grocery cart off a woman on Delaney for $12. Blue, 1 wheel that dragged, and I hauled that thing up and down Pike and 14th so many times over the next 4 days that the drag became a sound I'd hear in my sleep for months. 3 trips a day, small loads, cash. Nobody notices a woman with a cart. Nobody has ever once noticed a woman my age with a cart. Prasad's Market on the corner, which is the size of my living room and sells everything, and nobody under 40 ever goes in there. Lentils, dried beans, oil, tea, 40 pounds of flour in 8-pound bags because that's what I could carry. Mr. Prasad's son rang me up 4 separate times in 2 days without a single comment, which I appreciated more than I can say. 14th Street Restaurant Supply, which sells to caterers and has no limits on anything because their customers buy in bulk by definition. Institutional cans of tomatoes and green beans. A 25-pound bag of onions, which was too many onions, and also, it turned out, not enough onions. Bouillon. Salt, which I nearly forgot, and which became the most requested single item in our building by week 3. Ackley Hardware, where I bought 5 5-gallon buckets with gasket lids, a box of contractor bags, duct tape, 2 rolls of plastic sheeting, work gloves, and a manual can opener because my electric one had been the only one I owned since 2011 like an idiot. The dollar store for soap, bleach for cleaning, toothpaste, 200 feet of clothesline, and cat litter, which I bought 40 pounds of despite not owning a cat, and got a look from the cashier that I earned. Things I bought that were wrong. A butane camp stove and 4 cartridges, which was 2/3 of a good idea. You cannot run one of those in a sealed apartment, and I knew it, and I bought it anyway with a vague plan I never examined. It ended up living on the 2nd floor landing under the window that opens, which is fine. But 4 cartridges for 1 household is not 4 cartridges for 6 households, and I ran that math 3 weeks too late. Also wrong. I did not buy nearly enough of the small dumb things. Batteries, matches, ibuprofen, tampons and pads, which we did not have enough of for 4 women and a girl, and which nobody wants to talk about in a survival story. Reading glasses, playing cards. I had 90 pounds of dried beans and 1 deck of cards with the 7 of hearts missing. And I want to say this clearly because I know what the fantasy sounds like. I did not become prepared. At the end of 6 days, I had roughly 3 weeks of dull calories for one person. 60 gallons of water in buckets and a bathtub and a lot of empty juice jugs. About $600 left in cash, and no plan whatsoever for heat, garbage, sewage, or other people. 3 of those 4 turned out to be the actual problem. Wednesday, I made my worst decision, and I made it for a practical reason, which is how most bad decisions get made. I wanted access to a vehicle that wasn't Tova's, because Tova's belonged to her job. Lois Wardell in 3C drives for the delivery apps and has a minivan with the seats out of it. 55, loud, generous, and completely unable to hold anything in her mouth for longer than 90 seconds. I knew that about her. I knew it, and I went up there anyway, and I told her more than I told Tova. I told her the hospitals were staffing up for something starting the weekend. I told her it was serious. I didn't name Cheryl. Lois believed me instantly and completely, which was the problem. By Wednesday night, the version of my information circulating in the Del Court and, as far as I could tell, most of the 1,400 block was that the water was contaminated, that the bridges were closing Friday, and that the city was covering up a chemical spill at the rail yard. Not one word of that was mine. Every word of it was mine. And it did real damage. Prasad sold out of bottled water by Thursday noon to people who did not need bottled water. And then those same people watched their taps run clear all week and decided the whole thing was hysteria. And when it did start, they were 4 days behind and embarrassed about it. And being embarrassed makes people slower. Lois, for her part, bought about $900 of things on a credit card with the specific intention of reselling them, which I'll come back to, because it isn't as simple as it sounds. I lay in bed Wednesday night doing the thing I'd been avoiding all week, which was thinking about Cheryl instead of about groceries. Here is what I had. My friend of 31 years handed me 6 days out of her own pocket, at real risk, and asked me for one thing. Not money. Silence. And here's what silence cost. There were, counting me, 18 adults and 2 children in that building. Some of them I liked. Some of them I'd never spoken to in 8 years. The Ferreras in 1A, Joaquim and Nida, both in their 70s, retired off the City Parks crew with a little brown dog named Pinto. Kellen and Bex in 1B, young, both in the bar business, gone more than they were home. Emmett Dokes in 1C, 78, widowed since before I moved in. A man who said good morning to me maybe 400 times and never one other word. Hafsa O'Day in 2C, 33, on the phones at the gas utility. Marcus Deal in 3A, the 3 roommates in 3B, who I knew as a unit and not as people, which shames me now. Lois, Tova, and Simone. 2 units empty since summer. If I told them all, 20 people would move at once inside 4 blocks, and every one of them would be asked by somebody where they heard it, and the answer chains would run for exactly 1 hop before somebody said, Ruth Ann's friend works at Marchand. Cheryl was 14 months from her pension. Her husband Ford has been on her insurance since his back surgery in 2019. She was one of 4 people. Marchand fired a woman in the spring for forwarding a layoff list to her own personal email. It was in the paper for one day. I understood the whole shape of it Wednesday night, lying there. I understood that there was no clever third option, that a diluted warning wasn't a compromise, but a fake, and that every hour I spent looking for a way to have it both ways was an hour off the front of everyone else's 6 days. I did nothing about it Thursday morning. I went to work. Thursday is when it stopped being something Cheryl told me and started being something I could see. Around 11, Ozella came in to cash her check and said her granddaughter's surgery got pushed. Knee thing, scheduled for a month, called Wednesday night and moved to December. She was mad about it in a normal way. At 1 o'clock, our regional manager called the store and told Randy that we were to stop cashing anything after 2 and prepare an early drop. No explanation. Randy asked twice. He got told it was a corporate cash management decision. And I stood there and watched what that means at street level, which is that at 2:15 a man named Ruben, who works overnight at a cold storage warehouse, came in with a payroll check, and I had to tell him no, and he said, "I got paid though." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I got paid." And there was nothing after that. He stood there. Then he left, and I have never seen him again. At 3, Randy came out and told me to go home early, and on the way out he said quietly, like it was a joke, "Hospital's on diversion. My wife's cousin's an EMT. They've been driving people across the river all day." I got home at 20 to 4, and I sat on my bed with my coat still on, and I called Cheryl and she didn't answer. And then I got up and went to the 3rd floor and knocked on Marcus Deal's door. Marcus is 34. He was in a car accident at 22 and has a brain injury from it. And if you spend a day with him, you'd see that some things are hard for him and a lot of things are not, and which is which isn't what you'd guess. He works 4 shifts a week at the co-op on Delaney. He keeps a paper wall calendar and writes everything on it in pencil, and he does not like it when things are not on the calendar. I had rehearsed something on the stairs. When he opened the door, I threw it out. I said, "Marcus, I have information I'm not supposed to have. There's a sickness coming. The hospitals were told to be ready by Saturday. It's real, I believe it completely, and I've known since Sunday, and I should have told you Sunday. You should buy food and fill anything that holds water." He stood there. Then he said, "Who told you?" And I said, "Somebody who'd lose their job." He said, "Okay." He never asked me again. Not once, not in 5 months. He said, "Okay," and then he asked how much food, and I said 3 weeks. And he said, "I get paid tomorrow." And I said I'd cover it and he could pay me back, and he said no. He said the co-op does a discount for employees on Fridays, and he'd rather wait 1 day and get more. Which was correct. That was the correct answer, and it was better than mine. Then he took the pencil off the string on his calendar and wrote, "On Friday, food 3 weeks." And on Saturday he wrote, "Sickness?" I stood in his doorway and had to look at the floor for a second. 4 days I'd spent trying to find a way to say something true without saying it, and the whole time the actual sentence had been sitting there, about 11 seconds long, and the only cost of it was the truth about who paid for it. Friday, I told the building. I did it door to door, starting at 6 in the evening when people were home, and I said almost exactly what I'd said to Marcus, minus the source. Most of them asked where I'd heard it. I said, "From somebody inside a hospital system who is not allowed to tell me, and I'm not going to say more than that, and you can decide what that's worth." And then I stood there while they decided, which is a very long few seconds. Naide Ferreira believed me before I finished. She had already noticed that the clinic on Delaney hadn't opened Thursday. She was on the phone to her son in Fall River within the hour, and she spent Friday night making a list in Portuguese in a spiral notebook. And Joaquim went out Saturday morning at 6 and came back with the trunk of their Buick full. And God bless that man, because a third of what he bought was other people's later. Hafsa in 2C listened, said thank you, closed the door, and I thought I'd failed. She'd already put in for the week off. She'd been hearing it on the phones. She said the utilities call volume had a shape to it. People calling to ask about shutoff protection, a lot of them. 3 days running. Occupational pattern. She saw it before I did and said nothing, because who would she tell? Kellen and Bex in 1B were the hardest. Kellen asked me, not unkindly, whether the person who told me had been diagnosing patients or making spreadsheets. And when I said spreadsheets, he nodded like that settled it. Bex said her mother had a place 2 hours north and they'd just go if it got bad. They left the following Tuesday with 3 bags, and I have not heard anything about them since, which is not the same as knowing. Lois was insulted that I told everyone because it devalued her inventory. She said so out loud. Then she went out that night and bought 2 more carloads, and I'm still not sure which impulse was in charge. The 3 and 3B done, Rosalie, and a young man everyone called Pick. Heard me out on their landing and then had a 40-minute conversation in their kitchen that I could hear through my ceiling. And the outcome was that they pooled $200, and Rosalie went to the restaurant supply Saturday morning with my directions written on the back of a receipt. And Emmett Dokes in 1C opened his door about 4 inches, listened to the whole thing, and said, "All right." He'd been at Khe-Sanh in 1968, and he had a wall-mounted phone the color of an avocado, and I did not know a single one of those 2 facts until later. 12 doors. 6 of the 10 occupied units took it seriously inside 24 hours. That's a better rate than I expected and a worse rate than it should have been. And the difference between those 2 numbers is the 4 days I spent protecting my friend. I'm not going to pretend I've settled that. Cheryl's silence bought her nothing in the end. And if that makes it easier for me, then I should be suspicious of finding it easier. The Saturday she'd named came and went, and almost nothing happened, which nearly broke my nerve. There was a press conference at 2 in the afternoon in which a county health officer used the words, "a cluster of severe cases with an atypical neurological presentation," and asked people to avoid unnecessary emergency department visits. The hospital diversions were on the news as a traffic story. 2 schools announced they'd be closed Monday for what they called a facilities issue. That's it. That's the whole first day of it. I had 90 pounds of beans and a bathtub full of water and a county health officer saying atypical presentation. And Lois knocked on my door at 9 that night and said, "So? Here's what I've learned about the shape of these things. It didn't start on Saturday. It didn't start on any day. Cheryl gave me a real number from a real document, and the number was honest, but it was a number about hospital staffing, not about my street." It took another 6 days after that Saturday for anything to reach me. And it took 11 days for the power to go. And by then people were dead a mile south of me who'd been fine on the day I was standing in my kitchen feeling stupid. Anybody who tells you they knew when it started is telling you about themselves, not about the thing. What I remember of that first week after is the sound of the neighborhood changing before the look of it did. Sirens for 2 days, constant, and then no sirens at all, which was much worse. The co-op on Delaney went to reduced hours, then to a line at the door, then to a sign. Buses ran Monday, ran strangely Tuesday, stopped Wednesday. The gas station on 14th put out hand-lettered cardboard, "Cash only." Then, "Cash only, $40 max." Then nothing, and the pumps bagged. Marchand went to no visitors on the Monday. On the Tuesday, the county put a 2-block cordon around a residential stretch near the rail yard and would not use any word for why. And a reporter asked directly whether the illness caused violent behavior, and the man from the county said, "We're asking people not to approach anyone who appears disoriented." And then he took another question. That was the closest anybody official ever came, in my hearing, to saying it. I never heard an official use a real word for what those people were. In our building we said the sick for a while, and then we mostly stopped using nouns at all. You'd say, "There's one in the alley." You'd say, "Don't go out front." The first one I saw with my own eyes was Wednesday of that week, from my kitchen window, and it was not frightening in the way I'd prepared for. It was a woman in a long gray coat standing in the middle of Pike Street facing the wall of the laundromat. Just standing. Not swaying, not moaning, none of that. Standing with her face about 8 inches from the brick, for I timed it later, because I couldn't look away 19 minutes. Then she turned and walked north out of my view at a normal walking speed. I have thought about her more than about anything else I saw. Because if you'd shown me that on a video, I'd have said, "That's a person having a medical emergency, somebody help her." And the reason nobody helped her is that by Wednesday, everybody on that block had learned something they couldn't have told you they'd learned. The power went out on the 11th day, at about 4 in the afternoon, and did not come back on for 19 days. And this is where I learned what an apartment building actually is. I'd been braced for cold, and I'd been braced for the dark. What I had not thought about for 1 second in 6 days of shopping was that the gas would keep working and it wouldn't matter. Our boiler ran on natural gas, and the gas stayed on all the way through. But a boiler that size doesn't just burn. It has a controller and a circulator pump that pushes the hot water up through the risers to the radiators, and those run on electricity. So there we were with a basement full of perfectly good gas and 11 radiators going cold in a building in November. Joaquim went down and looked at it for an hour. with a flashlight in his teeth, and came up and said, in his careful English, "It works. It is only that it cannot move." He was 73 and had spent 30 years running mowers and salt trucks for the Parks Department. And he understood machines fine. He just couldn't make electricity. The temperature inside went from 68 to 55 in about 30 hours, and then it started tracking the outside with a delay. And outside, it was going down to 26 at night. That's the thing that reorganized us. Not the sick, not fear, cold. The meeting happened on the second-floor landing, because that's where the stove was and where the window opened. And there were 14 people at it, and it lasted a little over 2 hours and was, I want to say, extremely boring. Nobody made a speech. Nobody took charge. Rosalie from 3B had a notebook. What we worked out, mostly because Hafsa kept pulling it back to the practical every time it drifted, was this. Heat rises, and there was nothing we could do about the boiler, so everybody who could would move up. The ground floor was the coldest, and its windows were at sidewalk level, and the vestibule door had a lock that had been broken and fixed 4 times in 8 years. So 1 and 2 and 3 from the first floor came upstairs. The Ferreiras moved in with Hafsa in 2C, which nobody expected to work and which worked better than any other arrangement in the building. Emmett refused to move for 6 days and then moved into Marcus's front room in 3A, which is a sentence I'll come back to. Kellen and Bex were already gone. The 2 vacant units were on the 3rd floor, and Lois had a key to one of them from when she'd helped clean it out in July, which is the single most useful crime anybody committed in that building. We wedged the stairwell door at the bottom of the first flight with a mattress and a bureau, and we agreed the front vestibule and the whole first floor were not ours anymore. We stopped using the front door entirely and went in and out the back through the alley, one at a time, and only in daylight, and only when somebody was watching from a window. That was the shelter. Not a bunker, not a fortress. The top 2 floors of a 1927 walk-up, held together by an agreement between 6 households who had never had a conversation before that month. And I want to be honest about what held it up, because it wasn't the mattress on the stairs. Anybody could have moved that mattress in 40 seconds. What held it up was that 6 separate households all kept choosing to keep the same rules every day, with no way to make each other. The water went on the 14th day. Not a dramatic shutoff. The pressure just started dropping, and by evening the 3rd floor had nothing and the 2nd floor had a trickle, and by the next afternoon there was nothing anywhere. Nobody ever told us why. I assume a main broke somewhere and there was nobody to go fix it, or the pumps that pushed it uphill were on the same dead grid we were. My 60 gallons looked ridiculous to me that week. I'd been so pleased with myself. 60 gallons is 1 person for a month if you're careful, and it's nothing at all for 20 people. And by the 2nd week, it was not my 60 gallons. It was ours, and I'd be lying if I said I handed it over gracefully. I handed it over about 4 days after I should have, and I made a small, unpleasant remark while doing it that Tova heard, and we've never discussed it. Water is not the hard part, though. Getting water is a problem you can chew on. Getting rid of it is the thing that will beat you. 12 toilets stacked on top of each other in 1 brick building, sharing 1 waste line into the street, and no water to move anything anywhere. You cannot flush a toilet on faith. Within 3 days, it's a health situation. And within a week, it's the whole reason a building becomes uninhabitable. And no one in the history of the world has ever put that in a movie. So we did what people do, which was buckets and bags and cat litter and 1 designated place, and a rule about hands that Naida Ferreira enforced with the ferocity of a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a sister, and a garbage problem that got worse every single day with no end and no one coming for it. The bags went out the back into the corner of the yard behind the fence, and then when that got bad, they went into the ground floor of our own building, into Unit 1B, which Kellen and Bex had left, and the door of 1B stayed shut. That's what my 40 pounds of cat litter bought. Not comfort, not safety. About 11 extra days of that building being a place where human beings could stand to live. Lois turned out to be the most useful person in the Delcourt, and I need to say so. She'd bought all that inventory to resell, and for about 4 days she tried. And then 2 things happened. The first was that money stopped meaning much, faster than I'd have believed, faster than anybody who works in the money business would have believed. My $600 in cash was king for 9 days, and then it was paper, because there was nothing open to spend it at. The second thing was that Simone got sick, not that sickness, a normal fever. A 12-year-old with a fever and a cough, and Tova had no children's medicine. And Lois had 4 boxes of it in her van because she'd bought out a shelf. And she carried them down and put them on the landing and would not take anything for them. And after that, she was different. Or maybe she wasn't different, and I'd just been wrong about her since 2019. She also had the van, and the van is why we ate in December. Because on the 18th day, she and Dan drove 9 miles east to Dan's uncle's restaurant, which had been closed since the 2nd week, and came back with 140 pounds of rice, 4 cases of cooking oil, and 200 and something frozen egg rolls that had thawed, and which we ate in 3 days like it was Christmas. They were gone 9 hours. 9 hours, and none of us said out loud what we were all thinking. And when the van came down the alley, Nida crossed herself, and Marcus wrote it on the calendar. The dog was our first real fight. Pinto is a brown terrier mix, about 14 pounds, and he barks. He barks at the stairs, at the radiator, at Emmett's cane, at nothing. And by the 3rd week, the street out front was not empty at night, and sound carried the way it does when there's no traffic and no compressors and no hum from anything at all. The first time it happened, one of them stopped in front of our building. We don't know if the dog caused it. That's the part that made it unresolvable. Nobody could prove it either way. But Pick from 3B said what half the building was thinking, and he said it in the stairwell in front of Naide, which was the wrong way to do it. And Joaquim stood up out of a folding chair with a look on his face I'd never seen. We didn't solve it. There is no solution to that. What we did was move the Ferreras and Pinto into the back bedroom of 2C, the one that faces the yard. And Nida slept with that dog against her chest for weeks. And twice she took him into the bathroom and sat on the floor with him in the dark until it passed. And once a month, still, somebody brings it up sideways, and everybody remembers that we never actually decided anything. We just got lucky and then called it a decision. The thing at the vestibule was on the 22nd day, in the middle of the afternoon, which is not when you expect it. The front door had been getting worse. Somebody had gotten into the mail alcove twice already and gone through the boxes, which was just people, but the outer door didn't latch anymore. Rosalie was in the 2nd floor front unit and heard the inner door open, and then she heard someone come up the 1st flight and hit the mattress. Not push, hit, and then stop. And then a sound she described afterward as somebody standing still and breathing wrong. She came down the hall and got me because I was closest. And by the time the 2 of us were on the landing, there were 5 of us up there and nobody had a single idea in their head. What we did was nothing. That's what I want to put on the record, because I've noticed that people expect a scene here. Marcus came out of 3A with his hands up, palms out, and made a face at us that meant be quiet, and we were quiet. All of us, for what turned out to be an hour and 10 minutes, standing on a landing in the cold, not making a sound, while someone or something on the other side of a mattress and a bureau made small noises and shifted and did not go away, and then, eventually, did. Marcus was the one who thought to have Hafsa go to the back window and watch the alley so we'd know when it was out of the building. Marcus was the one who, afterward, said we should put something on the stairs that would make noise if it moved, and rigged the clothesline I'd bought in a pie tin. And it was ugly. And it worked. Nobody in the building ever said out loud that Marcus was the one who was good at this. Some of them still talked to him a little slow. He knows. He mentioned it to me once, in a completely level voice, like he was reporting the weather, and I didn't have anything to say back. Emmett Dokes died on the 27th day, in Marcus's front room, in his sleep, and it was his heart and not anything else. He was 78, and he'd been cold for 2 weeks, and he'd been out of 2 of his medications for 8 days, and there was nowhere on earth to get them. Tova, who does this for a living, had been checking on him twice a day, and she told me 4 days before that she didn't like his color, and there was not one thing either of us could do with that information. I'd known that man for 8 years, and I learned more about him in the 6 days he lived in 3A than in all of it. He'd been in the Marines. He'd worked at the water department for 31 years. His wife's name was Doris, and she died in 2014, and he kept her glasses in the drawer of the table by his chair. And he had a landline, a wall phone in his kitchen in 1C copper, on a plan he'd never changed because he'd never seen a reason to. It cost him $51 a month, and Lois had teased him about it in the laundry room once. The cell network went to nothing in the second week. The landline worked, intermittently, until nearly Christmas. That's not a lesson about telephones. That's a lesson about who I bothered to talk to for 8 years. The most valuable object in the Del Court belonged to the man I'd said 400 good mornings to, and asked nothing. What we did with him afterward was the hardest thing any of us did, and I'm not going to describe it. Joaquim and Dan and Pick and Lois did most of it. We put him in 1C, in his own place, in the cold, with the door closed and a chair against it. And Nida said the prayers because she was the only one who knew any, and we wrote it on a piece of paper with the date and the time Tova found him and where he was. And we put that paper in an envelope taped to the inside of the stairwell door so that whenever somebody came, they'd have it. He is buried properly now. It took until March. 2 days after Emmett died, we made the rule. It came up because of a man named Terrence who had come down the alley twice asking, and because Lois had let a woman she knew from the app driver world sleep one night in the empty 3C adjacent unit, and because we were, by anybody's count, about 5 weeks of food short of spring. 14 adults on the second floor landing again. 2 hours again. And what we settled on was, nobody knew. Not nobody helped. We agreed we'd give what we could out the back, and we did. We gave rice and water to people at that fence a dozen times, which is not nothing and is also not much. But nobody comes inside, nobody sleeps here, no exceptions. And the reason for no exceptions was that everybody in that stairwell could name one person they'd want to bring in. And if it was one each, we'd be 20 and dead by February. I voted for it. I want that in the record, too. I raised my hand for it, and I was one of the people who argued that it had to be no exceptions or it wasn't a rule. And I was right about that, and everyone knew I was right, which is why it passed. Cheryl called me on Emmett's phone 8 days after we made that rule. I'd given her the number on the 9th day, back when the cell network still worked in bursts, standing in Emmett's kitchen with his permission while he sat in his chair pretending not to listen. I'd talked to her 4 times since. She'd been sleeping in a conference room on the 3rd floor of Marchant Central since the 2nd week, on a cot, with about 200 other people. And they weren't letting staff leave the campus, and she said that in a tone that suggested it wasn't quite in order, and wasn't quite not. The 3rd call was the one where she told me that HR had asked her about communications outside the organization. They'd pulled badge logs and printer logs. They asked her, specifically, whether she'd discussed the framework with anyone outside, and she said, I told them no. I asked if it was because of me. She said there were 4 of them, and by then half the county knew, so how could anybody trace anything? She said it the way you say a thing you want to be true. I will never know. That's the honest end of it. It's possible I cost her nothing. It's possible that every hour I spent not telling my neighbors was a payment on a debt that wasn't even due. 20 people got 4 fewer days because I was protecting a woman who may have been perfectly safe the whole time, or who may have been sunk by a sentence I said to Lois Wardell on a Wednesday afternoon. That's not a resolution. I'm aware. It's just what it is, and I've stopped waiting for the part where I find out. The last call came on a Tuesday in December at 20 to 11 in the morning, and Marcus came and got me because he'd been down in 1C running the phone check we did twice a day. Cheryl sounded fine, and then she didn't. She said she was out. She said they'd let a group of them go because there was no more work to schedule, which is a sentence I've thought about a lot. She said Ford had been at his brother's since the 1st week, and the brother's house had somebody sick in it now, and she wasn't going there. She said her own house across the river had been standing empty for 6 weeks, and she'd driven past it Sunday, and the side door was open. She had a ride as far as the 14th Street Bridge with a respiratory tech who was going north. The bridge was open to foot traffic with a checkpoint, and from the bridge to my back fence is 1.5 miles, and she said she could walk 1.5 miles. And then she stopped talking and waited, because she wasn't going to make me say no by asking. I said, "Come Thursday, come in daylight, come down the alley and stop at the fence and say my name. Don't come to the fence quiet." Then I hung up the phone and stood in a dead man's kitchen on the floor we don't use anymore, in a building where I had voted out loud, in front of everyone, for a rule that says nobody comes in. That was yesterday. I've been up and down these stairs 11 times since, deciding which door to knock on first. Needy would say yes and Joaquin would say yes because Nighty did, and that's 2, and it's also the household with the least room and the most to lose. Marcus will say yes and he'll say it in 4 seconds and he won't think about the food, and I'd be using him and I know it. Hafsa will ask the right question, which is whether it's 1 person now or 3 people in January. Lois will vote yes and then say something about how it's different when it's mine, and she'll be right. Tova has a 12-year-old and a rule she believes in, and Tova is the one whose face I can't picture. And there's a version of this where I say nothing to anybody and just walk Cheryl up the back stairs Thursday afternoon and let the building find out at dinner. I've thought about that one enough times to be ashamed of it. She gave me 6 days. 6 days got me 90 pounds of beans, 60 gallons of water, $600 that stopped meaning anything on the 9th day, and about 4 extra days of warning for 6 households, which is less than it should have been and more than nothing. It did not get me safe. There is no safe. We are cold. We are down to 1 meal that counts. The front of our own building belongs to somebody else. And the thing that keeps us alive is that 5 other families keep choosing, every morning, to hold to something none of us can enforce. I have until about 2 o'clock Thursday. I know what I'm going to do. What I don't know is what it costs and who pays it, and whether this building is still a building afterward.